Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the Global Health Debates. My name is Dr. Natasha Matthews, and I'll be your host today. I'm a physician by background and Masters of Public Health candidate at Harvard with a passion for global health education, as I believe that this is key to creating a more just and equitable world. Each episode of this series will focus on different pertinent issues in global health. Today's episode is on climate change and health. Climate change, referring to the long-term shifts in temperatures and weather patterns, is an evolving threat that has been making our planet increasingly hotter every year. In fact, 5 of the warmest years since 1880 have occurred in the last decade. Indeed, Mark Twain once said, "If you don't like the weather in New England, just wait a few minutes." Currently, there are many global effects of climate change. Rising coastal levels lead to the relocation of whole towns. Increasing temperatures lead to food and water shortages, and extreme weather events and changes in disease patterns lead to greater mortality. Global warming affects us all, but as the Natural Resources Defense Council states, it most significantly affects the underprivileged, the economically marginalized, and people of color, for whom climate change is often a key driver of poverty, displacement, hunger, and social unrest. According to the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, if we don't limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius in the next decade, this can only get worse. While temperatures are undoubtedly rising, there are still many skeptics who question whether human activity actually affects climate change at all. So what does the evidence really show? Well, nearly all scientific literature says human activity has indeed exacerbated climate change. By releasing heat-trapping pollutants, including carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, into the atmosphere, these greenhouse gases capture and absorb sunlight, trapping the heat and causing the planet to get hotter. This is known as the greenhouse effect. Globally, 25% of emissions result from burning coal, natural gas, and oil for electricity and heat. And 24% of emissions result from the agricultural sector. So which countries are the main culprits? Well, on a country-by-country basis, China and the United States are the biggest emitters, accounting for 30% and 15% of all global emissions. So what do we do about this? Currently, there are 2 schools of thought on the best approach. Some people want to focus their efforts on mitigation, which involves reducing emissions. Others want to focus on adaptation, measures by which we create new technologies to deal with our new climate reality. On the mitigation side, many countries have pledged to reduce emissions through agreements, such as the 2015 Paris Agreement, which the US has now formally rejoined under the Biden administration. The push to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels has also led to the rapid adoption of electric vehicles. From 2019 to 2020, electric car sales have increased by 263% in Germany, 202% in France, and 140% in the United Kingdom. Other popular mitigation strategies include carbon pricing, where polluters have to pay financially for the greenhouse gases they generate. On the other hand, adaptation strategies help build resiliency against increasing temperatures. For example, in city planning, techniques can be used to bolster construction to withstand increasingly aggressive climate disasters. Other technologies include something called carbon capture, which aims to remove 19% of carbon dioxide emissions from power plants and industrial facilities, optimizing cattle diets with seaweed to reduce emissions, and using climate repair technologies to reflect more sunlight back into space. So again, I'm Natasha Matthews, and I'm presenting the Global Health Debates, a new global health mini-series presented by the Boston Congress on Public Health. To discuss climate change and its impacts today and ways we can make a real difference, I'm honoured and delighted to introduce today's panellist. So first, we have Dr. Caleb Dresser, who's an emergency medicine doctor and climate and human health fellow, who's working with the Center for Climate, Health and the Global Environment at the Harvard School of Public Health. Dr. Dresser's work focuses on the means to address health needs during and after climate-related disasters. We also have Dr. Matthew Eckelman, an Associate Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Northeastern University and an Adjunct Associate Professor at the Yale School of Public Health. He's a member of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change and was the lead analyst for the UK National Health Service Net Zero Carbon Plan for supply chain decarbonisation. We also have Dr. Britta Lundberg, a former assistant professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Emory University. She is the chair of the board of Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility and the Massachusetts Medical Society's Environmental and Occupational Health Committee, and her primary area of interest is the health effects of fossil fuel-driven climate change. So a warm welcome to the panel. Thank you so much for being here today. It's great to have you. I'm now going to start with the first question. So I'll first go to Dr. Lundberg. Are you able to summarize to us the results of the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report and some of the key things that we should take away from it?
Absolutely. So I think the most shocking thing about the report is that it keeps saying the same thing. And this is what the authors have concluded. The scientific evidence is unequivocal. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. Any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report, they say, is a dire warning about the consequences of inaction. And yet, we keep responding the same way again and again, right? With inaction. Couple things about the report. It focuses mainly on adaptation rather than mitigation. They acknowledge that a lot of things can no longer be prevented, but they also admit that there are limits to what we can adapt to. Another thing I'd underscore is that they say that the consequences of climate change are dire. What does that mean? What is dire? Well, as a physician, what strikes me are the similarities between climate change and maybe a patient who is end stage with COVID-19. The graphs of their pulmonary function, their lung function, and the lung function of our planet look a lot scarily alike, right? Anyway, I'll end there and turn it over to my other panelists.
I would say there were some specific predictions that this report made. This is the first of 3 reports that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is producing. The next ones will come out in April and September. This one focused on the physical science basis of climate change. And they made some predictions about what we might see in the coming century. And as Dr. Lundberg said, that these predictions are pretty scary. One that stuck with me as a civil engineer, we work a lot with protecting coastlines and buildings. And there was a prediction that we would expect the 100-year storm, a storm that would only come along every 100 years, is predicted to happen essentially every year by the end of the century. That poses really major challenges to coastal cities like Boston and other coastal cities all around the world.
Yeah, I agree with both of the other panelists, and I would also really emphasize that this report is telling us that we need to be acting now and that we need an all of the above approach. We need to be working to aggressively decarbonize. We need to be approximately halving carbon emissions within the next decade globally. And we need to be taking substantive steps to adapt in ways that protect cities and food security and a variety of other factors. And so as a physician, where I see patients coming into my emergency department with heat stroke or with respiratory effects after a flooding event, I think this is a very alarming report, but it also gives us a roadmap of what we need to be doing, and I would argue can do to address this issue.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm just thinking to myself, can you break it down for me, Dr. Dresser? If you had to say to someone who's never read the report, doesn't know about it, what would you say are the kind of 3 key things that everybody needs to understand to really get that this is an imminent threat?
Yeah, climate change is happening now and is affecting us and our health. It is caused by humans, and we as humans can solve this problem.
Great, thank you for outlining that for us. So that kind of takes me on to the next question. Obviously, I've mentioned before that there are skeptics out there. So I'll come back to you, Dr. Dresser. What would you say is climate change a naturally occurring process that we as humans, we can't do anything about it? Or have we caused this process? Have we made it worse?
Yeah, so I think, we could talk on a scale of millions of years, or we could talk on the scale of a human lifetime. And I think for most of the people listening to this, and for me, the scale of a human lifetime is what we should be talking about. And on the scale of a human lifetime, we have seen dramatic increases in the emissions of greenhouse gases that warm the planet. Those emissions are caused by humans. And the result of those emissions is warming of the planet, extreme weather, and a variety of effects on our health today and the health of people we care about. And so I see this as a human caused problem with human solutions. And we need to be taking steps to move to a more sustainable society in which we have reduced greenhouse gas emissions. And we need to be taking steps to protect ourselves and the people around us all over the world from the impacts that are already happening as a result of human activity.
And do you have any further insights on that, Dr. Eckelman, from your background as an engineer?
Yeah, I would say there's nothing really surprising about the fact that climate change is happening. The science of climate change and the science of radiative forcing, meaning these greenhouse gases that are being added to the atmosphere, they're absorbing some of the sun's radiation, and they let that radiation back down to Earth. They also absorb radiation that the Earth is emitting back to space. And that's the real problem. That's the radiation they're holding on to more and then re-radiating back to us. And the physics of this is very well known. And from the point of view of the total activity of humans, you might think, well, the atmosphere is so large and we're so small, how can we possibly affect the atmosphere? But given the scale of carbon that we've been putting in for decades and decades, if you add pollution to any body long enough, you're going to affect the concentration in that body. So it's not surprising at all that we're seeing concentrations rise, and we know what those concentrations are going to do based on physics.
Okay. And Dr. Lundberg, if I was to say to you, we've looked at the data in the past and, temperatures have changed previously. There's this cyclical pattern that comes round and round. Why is this any different? Like, why do we need to be concerned now? Why suddenly are we worrying about human activity? What would you say to that?
Yeah, so in response, I think when you look at the patterns of weather events and you take climate change out of the model, you can't account for it. And so if we could still have bad weather events, but you wouldn't have the severe weather events and the deviations to the extent we are now. Of course, it's always difficult to directly attribute any single event to, quote, climate change, but you have to look at what the models are telling us. Typhoons in Southeast Asia, hurricanes, we can model what a storm would look without climate change, and without climate change, we wouldn't be seeing this. I think that sometimes, however, this question gets to be so political. Is climate change caused by humans? Is it not caused by humans? And as a physician, I think that focusing on air, water, and soil pollution rather than climate per se is much more helpful, because no one denies that their kids are having asthma exacerbations and that they're getting a lot worse when the air pollution is worse, and that our human activities are leading to increases in that pollution. That fossil fuel driven air pollution also drives climate change, but tackling air pollution in our communities, which has immediate health benefits, is perhaps an easier goal than the formidable climate change, which so many find overwhelming. So that's what we at Greater Boston PSR are really focusing our efforts around.
Thank you. I think that's really powerful, saying that, looking at climate change from a health perspective can really appeal to anybody. And it can be much more straightforward to sort of see the consequences. I think that's a really important point. So I'm definitely convinced. So assuming that, climate change is indeed a great threat moving forward. I mentioned before we have these two main schools of thought. The first one being mitigation, to recap, that's sort of reducing emissions out of the atmosphere, and adaptation, so creating new technologies to live in our changing world. So Dr. Eckelman, I'll come to you. What do you think should be our chief strategy?
Absolutely, we need an all of the above strategy. As Dr. Dresser rightly said, climate change is happening now. There's evidence all over the world. People are being affected in different ways. And so we've already started adapting. Humans are wonderful at adapting and innovation and creating new technologies and deploying those technologies. And so that's well underway, and that's going to have to accelerate in the decades to come so we can protect people. And obviously some people are in much more vulnerable positions than others. But if we don't also do mitigation, it's going to make adaptation that much harder. We need to reduce as much as possible the emissions that we're having right now and in the coming decades. Otherwise, we're not just going to see 1.5 degrees C increase. We're going to see multiple, maybe 2, even 3, even higher than that degrees Celsius. And the physical implications each time you raise that temperature bar become much more difficult to deal with, meaning much more expensive. So the more money we can spend to avoid the problem in the first place, to do some mitigation, we're going to avoid those much higher costs in the future through adaptation. And the other thing I'll say is that we won't be able to adapt to everything. This is going to have very serious health consequences, very serious consequences for food systems, consequences for physical infrastructure, coastal cities that just might not be able to adapt and will have to be abandoned, priceless artistic cultural heritage that won't be able to be moved and will be lost forever. And it's a sad situation. And as much as we can avoid that, we should try to do the mitigation now.
I think that's a really powerful call to action, and something that I think is not well known is that even if we maintain the targets that we've set out in things like the Paris Agreement, so reducing that temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will still see mass destruction and health impacts. I think it's really important to outline that. I want to challenge you and just say, kind of, if you had to choose one strategy to focus more on, say we do have limited resources, like adaptation versus mitigation, which do you think is sort of more powerful?
Well, from my point of view here, the adaptation piece is probably the more powerful.
Okay, thank you.
Because we have climate change as an imminent threat. And so, when we see that prediction of a hurricane coming up the US East Coast, we're all here on the East Coast of the United States, and you see that prediction, it's too late for mitigation at that point. We need to deploy our resources to protect people who are in real danger right now. And so that's no surprise that's going to take a priority. Mitigation is a harder one because it involves a very complex industrial system. The way we make everything is tied up in fossil fuels, and it's going to take time and a lot of materials and investment in order to move the system. Think about it as the Titanic, right? You can't just turn on a dime. There's a lot of inertia in our technological system, and it takes time to make this transition.
Mm. And how about yourself, Dr. Lumberg, kind of coming from the position of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and I know your interest area is around, reducing emissions. What would you say to a focus on mitigation versus a focus on adaptation?
Right. So I agree with both Dr. Eckelman and Dr. Dresser. First of all, just to say that climate change is a huge health threat right now, here, today, in the United States, in the present. So often in the press, you see it as something that's going to happen in the future in some foreign country, somewhere else. But I think that we've gotten that memo in the country now, that it is an urgent threat now. In terms of mitigation versus adaptation, mitigation, by which is usually meant things like better emissions requirements for cars, made sense 15 years ago, but now the horse is out of the barn, and those incremental changes, we still need them, but we need immediate, massive changes. We have forced ourselves into adaptation. Adaptation means how can we change global agriculture so that we can manage resources better, warning systems for people by the coast so that they can evacuate until they have to leave those homes altogether. How are we going to deal with that? So really, because we missed the boat on mitigation and we aren't doing adaptation, we're in a tight spot. I also agree with both of my fellow panelists that there are problems around the concept of adaptation. As a physician, it's difficult to adapt when you have a tornado or a hurricane or an epidemic of diarrheal disease or to temperatures of 120 degrees. Humans have a surprisingly narrow set of temperatures at which they thrive. Heart attacks and strokes increase exponentially when it's either too hot or too cold for us. That said, CDC has some very good plans to support community climate resilience and health interventions, but they have no funding. They thought they would get some funding in the bill that just got passed, but they didn't get any. So what can we do? Most people in the US are quite worried about climate, according to the polls, but we don't talk about it. So I really urge our listeners today to talk about it, because the squeaky wheel gets the funding. The program, the CDC program for climate and health, I just heard from a CDC colleague, to support communities has a $10 million budget. The military has a $778 billion budget. We really need to revisit our priorities.
Again, a very powerful call to action. And, thank you for highlighting kind of the disproportionate funds that are targeted at different things when we have such like an imminent threat on our hands. And I appreciate the balance. You're both talking about adaptation, mitigation, and understandably a very balanced way, because we do need both. And I'm hearing slightly more adaptation, but, Dr. Dresser, what do you say to that? Do you agree, or do you think actually maybe mitigation is more powerful?
Well, I think there's the question of what's more powerful and the question of what we can do. I agree all of the above approach has to be happening right now. I think if you look at the long-term projections and the difference in some of these recent IPCC reports between a 1.5, a 1.7, a 2.0 Celsius world, those are enormous differences. As Dr. Eckelman was alluding to earlier, the fairly small degree differences 30 or 40 years from now translate into enormous differences in severity of weather, severity of health impacts, cost to companies, to individuals, to governments. So the mitigation is a very powerful tool. The issue is that we have to be doing adaptation now as well, because lives are currently at risk. And I think we have now got ourselves into a situation, as Dr. Lundberg was talking about, where even though a mitigation focus is really how you solve this problem, if solving it is the right way to think about it, we cannot avoid doing adaptation at this point. And so the question is, will we adapt intelligently now or on the fly as these disasters occur? Because if we think about something like a public works project, a stormwater management plan for a town or for a region, that takes years of allocating funding, doing the planning, doing the implementation, and then you have to maintain it. And so we cannot wait until we are already experiencing the well-modeled projected impacts that are coming in the next few years. We need to be doing the adaptation planning now, because there is also lead time involved in that. And so while I see mitigation as a very, very powerful approach to this, and one we need to be urgently pursuing, adaptation cannot be neglected as it has been up until this point. We have to be taking steps now to protect health in the years to come.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked a lot about, what we should do, what we can do, but moving forward, who should do it? So when thinking about these global interrelations and climate change mitigation strategies, who do you think needs to take the most ownership? We've got the global north, so, high income countries like the US, the UK, Canada, and we've got the global south, so, where the impacts are most being felt in India and Bangladesh. So who do you think needs to take more ownership? I'll direct that to you, Dr. Lundberg.
Yeah, sure. So My very strong feeling is that since the global north generally uses the global south to produce its goods, we should absolutely take ownership of the pollution that we create. And since the US, if we include our military, is one of the single largest polluters, we should take the lead. Yes, there's an impressive breakneck speed development in China, but still their cumulative emissions are less than ours. We in the US have all the power to change the equation, and we should use it. One of the power elements that I would hope for would be an unprecedented amount of international cooperation. The industrialized and polluting nations of the global north have a lot of power over the UN, which has no enforcement mechanism. So ultimately, any binding or non-binding resolution needs to come from an agreement between the global north countries. The power elements involved, governments, fossil fuel companies that fund political campaigns, surely will be involved. And should the polluter pay? Well, I would just note that we all pay with our health. The irony is that those who create the most pollution pay the least, and the disproportionate burden falls on those who are least able to suffer the consequences. But we all pay with heart attack, stroke, asthma, cancer, the health effects directly linked to climate change. But the point is that a minority and low-income communities suffer the most, but everyone suffers. No one is spared the health effects of climate change.
I think that's a really interesting take, that realistically, we do understand that the global south countries are seeing, flooding in Bangladesh, for example, which is having kind of huge effects on the local people. But you're right that we do all now have to deal with this and have to sort of suffer the consequences, even though it's not the same level across the world. So I want to talk a little bit more about kind of some of the power dynamics at play for, those in the audience that might not be so familiar. Dr. Dresser, could you maybe shed some light on that? Like, what sort of power elements are involved when we look at who should take responsibility and if they can or if they will?
Yeah, as Dr. Lundberg was alluding to, there are vast inequities in which nations are emitting greenhouse gases, which nations have the money to spend on moving toward a decarbonized energy system or a decarbonized manufacturing system, and which nations or populations within nations are feeling the impacts in terms of flooding and heat and other health harms. One of the really illuminating conversations around this was at COP26 a few months ago in Scotland, which is the international meeting annually to try to work together as a global community of nations to address climate change. And it was, I think, illustrative that one of the big issues that came up at COP26 was the issue of loss and damage and who pays for that. And the concern from a large number of highly impacted countries, which also are tending to be low and middle income countries that have not emitted a very large proportion of historical greenhouse gas emissions. Those countries are now experiencing impacts from climate change in ways that can be measured and modeled, and that are having substantive effects on the health of their populations and the functioning of their economies. And there is a lot of concern that those impacts are increasing and will continue to increase. And the position of a lot of those countries is somebody needs to help us deal with this, because we did not create this problem, and yet here we are being impacted. And so not only do they need financing to move toward sustainable energy systems, renewable energy, et cetera, they also need money to pay for rebuilding their bridges that were washed out in a flood, and that is going to be a recurring need over the course of this century. The position of a lot of the wealthier countries was that they did not necessarily want to get locked into a recurring financial commitment to pay for damages from climate change. And so I think from a power dynamics standpoint, there are very much different starting points with different financial power, economic power, different energy systems, and different existing investment in energy systems that remain very difficult to resolve at a global level.
Okay, thank you. And does the polluter really pay at all at the moment? Dr. Eckelman, what's your take on that? We talked a bit about the US and, them taking a lead. Are we anywhere close to that?
Yeah, I would say there's another set of power dynamics here that we can mention, which is the public sector versus the private sector. And a lot of these private companies, especially the larger multinationals, just by their name, you can see they're not operating in just one country. They have multiple spheres of influence, and some of them have, revenues that are in excess of entire countries' GDPs. So these are very, very large and important entities. And what's been really great to see over the past several years is the focus of larger companies, but companies of all sorts, on climate reporting and on climate risk. Companies are starting to see that there are very real risks to their own businesses, their employees, their customers, their entire business model to climate change, and it has many different manifestations. One easy one is, for example, there was a very large storm, Hurricane Maria, that came through Puerto Rico several years ago and was devastating to that country's infrastructure and population. It's also a location of a major manufacturing hub, a global manufacturing hub for pharmaceuticals. So wiping out the manufacturing capacity of Puerto Rico for several months really put the global supply chain for medicines into disarray for some very important medicines. And so these kinds of climate risks are becoming much more apparent to business, and many companies are starting to publish climate action plans and climate risk documents. Another interesting feature of this that's particular to the United States is a rule that's been proposed by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, just a couple days ago. That's going to require publicly traded companies to disclose their climate portfolio, essentially. So we're seeing a lot of action in the private sector about this.
Okay, all right. So we've talked a lot about kind of when we're looking at strategies, mitigation versus adaptation, and kind of who should do that, who should take responsibility. And I want to look at it now from a slightly different angle in terms of, technology, so adaptation, but versus taxes as a way of generating the revenue to deal with the issues of climate change. So Dr. Eckelman, I'd like you to maybe shed some light on what are some of the newer technologies on the horizon that could maybe help us adapt.
Sure. So adapt and mitigate. There are important technologies for both sides. And one important point to get across, I think, is that we don't need magic. We have a lot of the technologies we need already, and we've had them for a long time. We have very well developed cores of engineers and construction folks to implement these technologies and to get them out into the field. However, there are some newer technologies that might also be game changers. And so we're hopeful. I'm a technological optimist, and so I'm always hopeful that we'll be able to harness technology for good. So one of those technologies that people may have heard about is called direct air capture. And this is a way of taking emissions out of the air. So not just out of a chemical plant, but once the emissions have already gotten out there, all those many decades of emissions that we've already contributed to the atmosphere, this is a technology to get it back. Actually, it's a technology based on the pulp and paper making industry, similar chemistries that are taking place there. And the idea is to essentially absorb carbon dioxide so we can concentrate it and then desorb it and then capture it in a pure form. And then we can either try to do something useful with it, for example, make building materials, or we can try to bury it and essentially put it down into some kind of reservoir under the earth. And we can choose our reservoirs carefully so that there's a high chance that there's essentially reformation. The CO2 turns back into a rock, essentially, or is in a stable location that isn't going to escape again. So direct air capture, this is something people are really excited about. However, it's at a very small scale right now. And in order to ramp up, in order to make a really meaningful difference, we would need to build thousands and thousands of these direct air capture plants. Currently, there's fewer than 5, I think, commercially operating in the world.
So when we talk about direct air capture or carbon capture, there are some voices, I think, that would argue that actually it's sort of misselling this like idea that sounds great but really can't actually account for the amount of carbon we have and isn't really a viable strategy. Kind of what would you say to that? This idea that those who are kind of funding the technologies are overselling how much it can help us move forward.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of excitement about it and a little bit less understanding of how long the lead time is. You know, like any facility, you have to construct these direct air capture plants. You need steel, you need people, you need cranes. And when you're talking about, okay, now multiply this facility times 10,000, that's just a lot of material you have to somehow source and a lot of people you have to get on the ground. So this takes time, and as Dr. Dresser said, there's a permitting process. You know, there's a lead time associated with any of these projects. But it's certainly not the only game in town. There's also other technologies that we know very well are also good at sequestering carbon, like trees. and so one trend in my area as a civil environmental engineer is to try to get out of some carbon intensive materials that we're producing, like steel and concrete, and to try to make more of our buildings out of wood as a way of sequestering that carbon for long periods of time. And any sequestration we can do now and to put into a building will help keep that carbon out of circulation, not forever, but for several decades. And we can do that right now. There's been a lot of action and excitement in architecture and in civil engineering about moving over to using mass timber systems, wood-based systems, for most of our buildings if we can.
Thank you. And just moving on to the physicians on the call. From my experience as a physician myself working in the UK National Health Service, we're one of the biggest emitters of global emissions, in the UK. And yet we don't have a lot of technologies in health to try and improve things. Like I was so shocked to see that when I started working in a hospital, we didn't even have like basic recycling. And that was very disappointing. So are there any kind of new technologies on the horizon related to health that you can speak to? I'll come to Dr. Dresser first.
Sure. So, I think technology is part of the answer. A big part of the answer, though, is doing things we already know how to do and scaling them up. And so, yes, we should be investing in a lot of technology research, right? Making better batteries and direct air capture work is great. But there's a lot that can be done right now with existing technology with the appropriate policy impetus to do it. So one simple example of that in the emergency department setting is, how are you giving your antibiotics? Are you hanging them in a little bag with plastic tubing that connects to a patient and running that for a half hour, or are you pushing them in a syringe over a period of a couple of minutes? For some drugs, not all drugs, but for some drugs, that second option is equivalent. It is just as safe and just as effective, and it uses far less plastic, which is produced from fossil fuels in an energy-intensive process. And so that's an example of something where a behavior or policy change at a healthcare institution might reduce a little bit of plastic waste every time we give common antibiotics. And if you scale that up across a health system, that's a big impact. And I think there are a lot of other examples like that where we can be using existing technology to reduce emissions. The fact that I am zooming into this conversation today rather than driving to your studio is a good example of that. We're using an existing technology that reduced a little bit of carbon emissions. And so I think there's a lot we can be doing now to incentivize those things that needs to be happening in parallel with the technology research that's ongoing. Over to you, Dr. Lundberg.
Absolutely. So about 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the US are due to the healthcare sector. And there are tremendous areas that we can cut back. We can build our buildings. Mass General is putting up a brand new building and originally was not doing it in way that was mindful of its energy footprint, put it that way. And so there are multiple areas that we can advocate for. Coming back to your original question on technology versus taxes, I'd just like to say that I feel that's a bit of a false choice. And maybe it's neither technology nor taxes. Let's just look at renewable cars. It wouldn't be good if we've converted every single car in the world to renewable, because we destroy our world. The World Bank just came out with a study. It projected how much lithium would be needed, the number, and in addition, the number of components that you would have to mine. And it was unbelievable. It would increase the mining of lithium by 1,480%. So we don't have enough lithium in the world to allow us to all have green cars and solar panels. We really need to change the way we live. Lithium is also an extractive industry. You were starting out our discussion with mention of equity. A lot of this extractive industries happen on indigenous lands, and they're also extremely water intensive. And the majority of egregious extraction projects are located in areas where the local people don't own the land rights. Chilean lithium, the Atacama Desert, one of the driest places in the world, is indigenous land. So they're losing their water to extraction. It takes 500,000 gallons of water to produce 1 ton of lithium. I also want to reiterate what my co-panelists said. We don't really need new technologies. We really have to rather go back to some of the old technologies before our love affair with fossil fuels started. And coming back to taxation, I just am not a real believer in that taxation is a mechanism. If you tax fossil fuels, is that equitable? A carbon tax, carbon offsets, often those are just a distraction. What we really need to focus on is changing the mindset that endless economic growth is a good thing, that an economy must grow a certain % every year. That amount of consumption that we currently have in the world today, it's just not sustainable. There's a quote, I can't remember who said it, the growth without limits is the ideology of the cancer cell.
That's an interesting quote and very powerful. Yeah, and I take that challenge about the kind of false dichotomy of technology versus taxes. But I would say, okay, let's say I agree with you, let's say there's no role for taxation. Dr. Eckelman or Dr. Dresser, what would you say to that? Do you think, there's a role, if any, should taxation play a role in increasing compliance?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on this question. Whether it's taxation or development of technology, the overall mechanism is the same, that investment by private industry anyway is a function partly of price of things. And what's so exciting about the situation we're in now is that we've provided support for renewable technologies. There's been government support in a variety of ways. And we're at the point now where the cost of producing electricity from solar panels is cheap. It is so cheap compared to what it was. It's also cheaper than any other way of producing electricity. It's cheaper than nuclear, it's cheaper than natural gas, right? And once you make this economic case, and let's say a power company is deciding, oh, what am I going to do? Where am I going to invest my next power plant? They are out to make money, and they're going to invest in the option that's most economically favorable. And so right now we're in this great position where the economics line up with the environmental goals and also the health benefits of renewable technologies. And this is why we're seeing this incredible shift away from fossil fuel fired power generation in the United States and towards renewables. We're growing renewables from a very small level. So the growth has been fast, and you also noted the growth in electric vehicles earlier, and yeah, several 100%. But when you start from a small level, several 100% means you're still pretty small. So we need the sustained growth over time. But I think if you said 20 years ago to people in the energy industry in the United States, hey, coal-fired power generation is going to go down from its peak around 40%, whatever it was, down to where it is now, and it's now been overtaken by renewables, they would say, no way, impossible. The energy system just doesn't change that fast. But now that we have the economics lined up this way, it's really amazing to see how.
Thank you. And Dr. Dresser, how about yourself? What's your take on taxation as a method of increasing compliance?
Yeah, I mean, from an adaptation standpoint, I think the issue of urban heat is a good illustration of some of the complexity here. So urban heat is an issue. It affects people's health. It can land people in the emergency department. I see this every summer. And it is getting worse as a result of climate change. And so as we look at health threats in, for example, the temperate zone and many subtropical major cities, this is one of the big health threats people are facing. And how do we deal with this? Well, part of the story is mitigation, make climate change not be as bad as it could be. But if we're looking at the adaptation side of it, there's a technology story, there's a public policy story, and some of that is funded by taxation. And then I think there is a third story, which is we have the technology, we even understand some of the policies that work, they just need to be implemented at a community level. And when you break this down from a technology standpoint, yes, things like air conditioners and more modern heat pumps can be really important. Battery backups to run some of those things if the power grid goes down are important. And a power grid that is stable during high load is really important for keeping people safe, keeping hospitals running during heat waves. But technology is not the full answer. And there are a lot of things that can be done right now with existing technology that is very actionable at the scale of municipalities or regions. Some of those examples include urban green space. Somebody mentioned trees a few minutes ago, shade, evapotranspiration. They're also pretty nice to look at. They increase the value of properties in a neighborhood. So there's a lot of value to simple things like planting trees in neighborhoods. Albedo effect, which in simple terms is saying if you paint your roof white, it won't be as hot in the summer. That is a very powerful effect, and at the scale of a city can have a discernible effect on local air temperatures. And then there's a lot we can be doing with architectural design. A lot of people spend much of their lives indoors. And the more that we're designing healthcare facilities, businesses, and homes that are energy efficient, well insulated, or are designed to allow cross breeze and passive ventilation, the more that we will be keeping people safe from the heat waves to come. There's also a whole layer that is about interpersonal stuff. This does not even necessarily require a huge amount of money, but it does require some to have people run programs and do outreach. And these are things like check on your neighbor programs. One of the cases I will always remember as a patient I took care of in my emergency medicine residency, who was brought in from the third floor of an apartment building on the top floor in a summertime heat wave, where she had gotten very dehydrated and had some medical complications of that because she was not strong enough to pick up and install her new air conditioner in her window before the heat wave. Totally preventable medical emergency. And if she had known her neighbors, if her neighbors had known to check on her, it probably would have been entirely avoidable. And so there are now programs being implemented in places like New York City to get neighborhoods aware of who's around them and just knock on that person's door on the hottest day of the year and see if they're okay and see if they need anything. And that doesn't cost a lot of money. It's a people-to-people solution, and it definitely saves lives when people are doing that. So that's a individual level one. At a policy level, we could be talking about outdoor workers in hot weather. And there's a lot we can be doing to protect people from heat stroke in agricultural work, in construction work, in other outdoor industries, by just avoiding working during the hot part of the hottest days of the year. Some parts of the country are doing better at this than others, and there's a lot of labor safety conversations to have there. And so those are things where, yes, taxation supports some of the public policy to do those things, but it's not very expensive solutions to keep people safe. And I think we should be taking immediate action on a lot of those things.
On the taxation front, I would just add one more thing, which is that the countries, for example, who have taxed methane leaks, and we in Boston have recently, a study just came out showing that methane or natural gas leaks in our city are 6 times higher than EPA estimates. Those have been very successful in decreasing things like gas leaks. And the other thing is just law enforcement. We don't necessarily need new laws. We just need to enforce the ones that we have. For instance, the Clean Air Act, where enforcement dropped by over 50% in some parts of our country in the last 4 years. And I haven't seen much evidence that that's changed. So that kind of thing is extremely effective.
Thank you, Dr. Lundberg. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about this idea of taking carbon out of the air, and I want to go back to that. And I really want to kind of illustrate to our audience, some of which might not be that familiar, about kind of carbon capture, kind of what it is and how it works. So I'm afraid I'll come to you, Dr. Eckelman, on that. Could you just give us a brief summary about carbon capture and how it works?
Sure, there are a few ways that we do it. There's some natural ways that we do carbon capture, and then there are some engineered ways. The largest natural sink is the ocean. And so carbon dioxide, we send it up into the atmosphere, and then some portion of it, that CO2, if you increase the concentration in the atmosphere, then that CO2 can migrate down and basically dissolve into the ocean. And the ocean has been very kind to us in absorbing a lot of the CO2 that we've emitted over the decades. However, this also makes it more challenging to meet our long-term effects. So even if we emit zero starting today, we just shut everything off, at least the natural sources of carbon dioxide, then the concentration in the atmosphere will go down. However, the ocean will then let go of some of the CO2 that it's absorbed over the years. And so there's a lot of inertia. It'll take time. And so we'll experience this warming for at least another couple decades, just because of this inertia in the climate and the carbon dioxide cycling. So that's dissolved CO2 into the oceans. Of course, we all know photosynthesis and how CO2 gets absorbed into plants. And if we can use those plants, for example, in durable wood products, we can also use those plants. We can, for example, grow sugarcane and use that sugarcane to make some materials that are durable materials. We can replace petrochemical plastics with bioplastics. We can replace petrochemical fuels with biofuels for those types of machinery that we don't have an electrified option quite yet, like for air travel. So there's some good options for us to harness natural technologies, natural solutions to make a big dent in emissions by sequestering carbon. In terms of the carbon capture, this engineered carbon capture, there's also a few different ways that we can do it. One, and they're all very interesting and deploy different kinds of technologies, but mostly it's about chemistry. It's about trying to get some kind of material that will absorb carbon and either absorb it and lock it away. So we do this, we can grind up a certain kind of mineral and spread the mineral around, and CO2 from the atmosphere will bind with that mineral and just make more rocks, basically. So that's called carbonation. So that's one technology that we're talking about. Another is where we capture CO2, as I mentioned, either directly from the atmosphere, or we capture it from industrial processes. Right? So for example, in order to make steel, or in order to make concrete, just the chemistry of that process means that we have some CO2 emissions in the facility that go up the smokestack, basically. And so we can run those emissions through one of these chemical reactors. And we have some chemicals that essentially absorb the CO2, remove it from the power plant or industrial facility emissions. So now we're mitigating those emissions. Those don't go into the atmosphere. And then we can use that CO2 that's been absorbed and then concentrate it. We get basically pure CO2 back out. And as I mentioned, then we can either put it down in some underground reservoir, or we can make stuff with it. We can even make fuel. There's a company that's now even making spirits, making liquor out of captured CO2. And so that's kind of an aside. That's not going to help us very much because, of course, that CO2 then gets re-emitted. But CO2 is a very commonly used industrial feedstock. We use it for so many things. So there's a big market for it. And if we can harness that market by reducing the cost of CO2 capture, basically, if we can make this CO2 capture the cheapest way to get CO2, then we'll do a lot more of it, and there'll be a larger market for us to have some sequestration in our technological system.
Okay, I mean, I'm pretty sold. You've given such a wide variety of ways in which we can get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere in order to tackle climate change. I might even go as far to say maybe carbon capture can solve climate change. And I wonder, Dr. Lundberg or Dr. Dresser, if you would challenge me on that.
Yeah, I would challenge you on that because I do feel that there are significant risks to this technology. The risk, first of all, that fossil fuel companies and others are going to use carbon renewal as yet another way to shift, to not change their corporate business models. It just delays coming up with a master plan for ending fossil fuels. Another risk, as Dr. Eckelman and Dr. Dresser, I believe, also pointed out earlier, is that carbon capture is years away from being viable. So it's a nice, potential, interesting solution for the future, but it's not what is going to save us right now. And it is problematic if there's a small leak or a major leak in the carbon capture technology, that could create huge problems and potentially more devastating than allowing nature to absorb those asphyxiant gases as they do such a good job of in general. Other technologies that have been technological solutions that have been proposed to mitigate climate change, but actually may make it worse, is something like hydrogen. Hydrogen is another, especially fossil fuel derived hydrogen, which makes up 99% of what we currently use, pollutes more across its life cycle than coal or diesel or gas, and is incredibly hazardous to health because of its explosive hazards. It increases nitrogen dioxides, which we as physicians worry about a lot when it's combined with methane and burned, as is currently being proposed in our state, because that will increase air pollution for our patients. I think one of the best technological solutions is to use less and to make it automatic. Professor Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, said how powerful it is to make things automatic so people don't have to opt in. It just happens. And I think that we need to make building less built into our system in the medical world, in all of our different spheres. We have done exactly the opposite deliberately for year after year after year, but it's really time to change that economic model. Thanks.
And how about you, Dr. Dresser? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, we need an all of the above approach. And I think there is potential for benefit in a variety of technologies that are not currently online and will not be online for some time at scale. Those are things ranging from carbon capture to the always 5 years away possibility of somebody making a fusion reactor. And for all of these technologies, there is risk, there's potential benefit, and there's a timeline to implementation. And when you multiply those three things together, we probably should continue to research these for something like carbon capture, we should look at how could we scale this up in a way that is safe and effective. But I don't think that we can rely on any of these because climate change is already affecting people now. And as Dr. Lundberg was alluding to, the most effective way to address that is to reduce fossil fuel combustion immediately. And there are ways to do that with some existing technologies. And so I think we need to be not shifting a zero-sum game amount of money between different solutions. We need to be expanding investment in all of these solutions. And that probably means devoting a lot of R&D money to things like carbon capture, but also spending some money on things like community health assessments and other things like that that allow us to adapt to climate change and may also empower people to talk about whether they want a facility doing carbon capture or burning fossil fuels or something else in their community. Because as we've seen with every technology wave that has occurred over the last several decades, the siting of industrial facilities is not equitable. And so we need to be very thoughtful as we contemplate another wave of technology transitions about how we actually make that happen in practice. So I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of good ideas floating around, and I think there are a lot of solutions that are pieces of the big picture answer. And we need to have people working on all of these in a way that thinks about who's being impacted and what the long-term plan is.
Thank you very much. I wanted to also just come back to something that we talked about earlier and get your take, Dr. Lundberg, from your experience as a physician. We were talking about kind of healthcare systems and facilities themselves as like a problem in climate change and how they themselves do emit a lot of greenhouse gases. I just wondered if there's anything further that we haven't touched on that you wanted to add about, potential ways that, we as physicians and the way we work in hospitals or, in other primary care, etc., how we can actually address this.
Well, I think one of the main ways is to ensure that our hospitals are getting off fossil fuels just as the rest of the economy is, right? So if we build natural gas power plants to fuel our hospitals, has been proposed locally here, we're not helping the problem. I think that the Gunderson Clinic in La Crosse, Wisconsin, stands out as a stellar example. They have a tremendous solar field, and it fuels their entire hospital plant there. And I feel like every single establishment should be doing that, including the Massachusetts Medical Society, where I'm affiliated with. I'm hoping that we will do the same.
Okay. And so we've talked about what we can do as physicians, and now, what about everybody? Like me as a general person, kind of going about my daily life, what can I actually do to address some of these huge concepts we've discussed today that seem kind of nebulous to an average citizen, particularly here in the US, where we don't have to deal with some of the same challenges that, those who are really suffering the disproportionate burden of climate change do?
Before we go to that, Dr. Matthews, I'd like to jump in on the previous question, if that's possible.
Please do, yeah.
Yeah, so there has been really a sea change here in the US in the healthcare sector around accepting responsibility for healthcare sector emissions and trying to implement change. There's been some very vocal advocates for years and years. And now we're starting to see really mass shifts towards carbon emissions reporting by some of our largest healthcare organizations. We have now the National Academy of Medicine getting in the game. They have a decarbonization action collaborative that many institutions are now part of that are trying to set standards for reporting and make recommendations on exactly your question. What can hospitals do? What can physicians do? What can procurement professionals do? Everybody in the healthcare sector has a role to play, and so we can work with these large institutions in a collaborative way to really make a roadmap to have some guidance out there and some really great case studies like Gunderson. But I did want to just note that that the emissions of the healthcare sector are complex. Healthcare is something like a fifth of our economy now. So we spend around $4 trillion on healthcare here in the United States. And it's no surprise that those dollars have some emissions implications. And something that we do in my research group is to quantify those emissions. And that 10% number that was quoted earlier is from our group, from a study we did several years ago. And we've updated that, and I'm glad to say emissions have come down a little bit as a percent of the US total. So it's something like 8.5% now. But if you look at what makes those emissions, 80% of it is from the supply chain. It's actually not from building operations, and it's not from purchased electricity. It's from purchases of all of the other stuff, all the drugs, all the plastics, all the equipment. And so the point that Dr. Lundberg has made several times around doing your job, providing clinical care, caring for the patient, but with less waste, that is going to have really big implications. And we're not going to get to net zero in the healthcare system without attacking these supply chain procurement-based emissions. And there's lots of innovation in the supply chain, and the healthcare system can help that innovation go faster by sending price signals, and also by doing education around healthcare waste. And I think for the physicians watching this call, certainly if you go to see some OR waste, I mean, it's amazing the amount of solid waste that's generated, and all of that material had to be manufactured and had some carbon associated with its manufacturing. So there's a lot of opportunity for savings there.
Yeah, certainly. I spent some time actually in a hospital in New Zealand, in Auckland, and they had implemented recycling in the operating theatre, which generates so much plastic, so much waste, and we have haven't seen, I should say, nothing like that in the UK, and it really made a huge difference. And it was just one hospital that was really taking the initiative locally as a grassroots movement to actually, enact such significant change. Okay, so just on my previous question, I'd really like to get all of your take on kind of what I, as an average person, can really do. We've talked a lot about such complex technologies, but what can I really do now, tomorrow, when I go about my daily life? I'll come to you first, Dr. Dresser, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, first of all, do not give up. I think when you spend time talking about climate change, thinking about climate change, reading about climate change, this can feel overwhelming. It's a huge problem. It's affecting billions of people. The forces at play here are enormous. But I think it is really important to remember that you can have impact. And there are a variety of ways you can have impact. And so what I would say is find the way to have an impact that makes sense for who you are, where you are, and what role you have. And for some people, the answer is going to be take individual actions that reduce your carbon footprint. Fly less on jets, eat less red meat, take steps that reduce your carbon footprint. And that's important. But that by itself is not going to solve this problem. And so we also need people working on other dimensions of addressing climate change. If you're looking for some individual action you can do, I think the first thing you can do is stop being an individual. Find some people around you that also want to work on this issue with you. And that may mean talking to your neighbors about how to stay safe in a heat wave, or it may mean joining a local advocacy group that's trying to move for legislation at state or federal levels that build systems that are better for our planet long term. And so my simple advice is don't give up, find some people to work with, and take actions that make sense from where you're coming from.
Thank you, Dr. Dresser. And finally, Dr. Lundberg, was there anything you wanted to add just to help the average person really make change?
Yeah, I agree. This can all be so overwhelming. So much damage has been done, fossil fuels, monocropping, industrial agriculture, mining. But we have to remember that our best carbon sinks, our best ecological allies, if you will, are healthy forests, salt marshes, peat bogs. Those are our allies. So look around you and protect them. Be that squeaky wheel. We have the Belle Isle Marsh here in Boston, which is at risk. Speak up. as my colleague at CDC said, the war that we should be waging in a really with singular focus right now should be decreasing all sources of pollution so that human survival and that of millions of species on Earth can be assured. By accepting the needless death toll of climate change, which disproportionately affects low-income populations, but ultimately puts all of our health at peril, we're losing valuable time. We're all at risk, and we should start acting like it. And I encourage everyone listening to join, as Dr. Dresser said. We have Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. We're not just physicians. We have artists, we have community members, we have everyone in our midst. And we do make a difference, and we do speak up. And I feel like our individual voices do get heard so much more powerfully when we speak as a group.
Thank you. And Dr. Eckelman, do you have any final words you'd like to add as well in terms of a call to action?
Yeah, I really like the way my fellow panelists have put this, and I wholeheartedly agree. It is really hard. It's a hard message to internalize. It's hard when you think about the impacts on yourself, just from a self-preservation point of view. What is my life going to be like in 50 years? And what's my community going to be like in especially a vulnerable area? And it's hard when you think about the impacts we're having on other people around the world, and also our children and our children's children. That's a really tough message. And so it's paralyzing in some way. And the inclination is, well, I need to stop doing everything right now. And of course, you can't do that, right? You need food, you need shelter, you need some kind of employment, and some kind of activity that motivates you in life. And so an expression I often use is, to live is to consume. We are organisms on Earth. We need inputs in order to survive. And so getting to zero inputs is not the goal. We want inputs that are regenerative. We want to transform our systems to produce inputs that we need, building materials, right? And food systems and other sorts of materials that support our daily lives. We need to find ways to make those in a way that's low carbon, or even better, regenerative and help sequester carbon. So for those of you in the private sector, I would say, step on the gas, right? Do something that you care passionately about, that helps produce new innovations that can help us attack this carbon issue, either mitigation or adaptation-wise, or something that helps people consume less. Right? There's a lot of technologies out there and a lot of exciting things that people are working on. And for those of us who aren't in the private sector, or in general in civic society, I would just say, keep talking to one another. There's so much information out there, and there's so much misinformation out there. And just by talking to your friends and family about this issue, talking about what they're doing or what they're feeling, how they deal with the emotions around climate change, having that conversation out in the open just helps change our societal mindset around the importance of this issue. And I think it was brought up earlier, polls recently showing, the majority of Americans feel strongly that climate is an important issue, that they care about, that they even base their voting on. And the more we keep that conversation out in front and in the public sphere in our own lives, that'll really help build awareness and motivate all of us to do our part.
Thank you. I think we've covered a lot of ground today, so I'll just briefly summarize some of the key things we've talked about. So we've really, really hit home that climate change is happening now, and it's a threat to our health. And that's something I really want people to take away from this broadcast. Also, we've really talked about, mitigation versus adaptation, technology, taxes, but really we need an all of the above approach. And I feel that comes up time and time again. We've also talked a lot about funding and where funding comes from. We talked about how at the Conference of Parties in Glasgow previously, there was a real focus on loss and damage and how, countries that have suffered disproportionate burdens need the money to rebuild. And, the reluctance coming from those polluters that we've also talked about in terms of making those financial commitments. Dr. Lundberg made a good point about, the US should take the lead because they're one of the biggest polluters. But we also need unprecedented international cooperation. And again, I think time and time again, we've talked about the need to collaborate with others, an interdisciplinary approach, both at the high level where we're coming up with the ideas, the policies, the technologies, but also as individuals. We've talked about the need to not give up and take individual action, whether that's sort of reducing your meat consumption, flying less. But we've also said that stop being an individual and actually talk to your neighbors, see how you can help, make sure they're okay if there's a heat wave. But you can also join advocacy groups. I think there's been some great examples, like Physicians for Social Responsibility, that we can all go away and join. It's great to hear that it's not just for physicians. We've also talked about how we actually have a lot of the policies in place, such as the Clean Air Act, but actually do we enforce them? So it's about enforcement rather than coming up with new ideas. And Dr. Eckelman, I think you said, we don't need a new technological magic thing. We already have a lot of the technologies we need. So it's about kind of using those. And then Dr. Lundberg, you also said that maybe going back to some of the old technologies that were used, rather than, trying to find this silver bullet. Also on tech, we mentioned that you actually can't rely on, just one form of technology. Every form of technology has a risk, a benefit, and a timeline to implementation. And specifically, things like carbon capture, they take years to actually take effect. So if we rely on that alone, we're setting ourselves up for failure. And finally, just our personal accountability, be that squeaky wheel. I really liked that, Dr. Lundberg. Speak up and, keep talking about this. And keep doing what we can. So I really want to thank you guys all for coming today. That's Dr. Britta Lundberg, Dr. Matthew Eckelman, and Dr. Caleb Dresser. I've really enjoyed speaking with you all. I look forward to seeing what happens now. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Natasha.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Great to be here.
This has been the Global Health Debates, presented by the Boston Congress of Public Health, and I hope to see you all at our future episodes. Later today, we'll be talking about the migration crisis and social unrest.